Although the World Bank has marginally downgraded its forecast for East Asia and the Pacific for 2023 by only 0.1%, it's a very marginal downgrade. They're still expecting growth to be 5% this year. So the East Asia region is going to outperform other regions of the world by a very considerable margin. So basically, East Asia and the Pacific will be the fastest growing region of the world, along with India as well. And actually, if we look back to what happened in 2022, the East Asia and Pacific region grew at 3.4%. So actually, 2023 is a stronger growth rate than last year, even though there's been a marginal downgrade. So I think the overall picture is one where China is growing somewhat faster than last year, even though its recovery is facing challenges. And what we're seeing in ASEAN is that Indonesia is actually performing very well, a very stable, strong growth last year and also this year. And a number of other Southeast Asian economies are still showing quite strong domestic demand, although there are headwinds from the export sector.
Okay, back to the World Bank predictions. The World Bank also warns of rising global debt levels, both governments and corporate debt, especially you name it, China, Vietnam, and Thailand also. Is this one of threats affecting economic growth in these Asian countries? So what is the worry that is causing several countries to appear increasingly depressed?
I think when we look around the world at emerging markets and the levels of both domestic debt and external debt, the situation varies quite considerably across different countries. And I think broadly in the East Asia region, most of the big economies have a relatively good external debt profile. So the vulnerability to external debt in most of the countries is relatively moderate. And that's because many of the big industrial economies like China, Thailand, and also some of the other major economies like South Korea have very large net external assets in their balance sheets. In other words, they hold a lot of assets abroad, so the net debt position isn't so great. However, there are some troubled countries in the East Asia region, which are some of the smaller countries like Laos, which do have high external debt. And also we need to look at domestic debt, because domestic debt is also a potential vulnerability. And I think here, countries like Indonesia, Philippines in ASEAN have made a lot of progress because they learned many lessons during the East Asian crisis and have brought their government debt levels down to relatively low levels. So although there is some concern perhaps about some of the corporate debt in some of the countries, broadly speaking, the vulnerability in the big East Asian economies is relatively less than in other regions of the world. And if we look at, for example, in the Middle East, Turkey is having a very long economic crisis due to very heavy external debt. In Latin America, also Venezuela, Argentina are also in deep economic crisis. So I think the East Asia region is actually relatively performing quite well because their macroeconomic management has improved very considerably.
Okay, you mentioned in that Indonesia is one of the countries in Southeast Asia that will grow in 2024. What it makes Indonesia economy growing better than countries in the Asia regions? What factor it is?
I think one of the strengths of Indonesia in this very difficult global environment where many of the big export markets are weak is that Indonesia is very much a domestic-driven economy. So the key drivers for Indonesian GDP growth are actually private consumption, government consumption and investment, and private investment. And Indonesia's reliance on exports is relatively more moderate compared to many other East Asian economies. So at the moment, when some of the export sectors are relatively weak around East Asia, particularly, for example, the electronics export markets in Europe and also in China are quite weak at the moment. So one of the strengths of Indonesia is that it's not so reliant on exports. But having said that, I should highlight that Indonesia has made some tremendous achievements in diversifying its exports, particularly downstream processing of nickel and the development of electric vehicle battery manufacturing. And of course, in the future, more manufacturing of electric vehicles. So actually, Indonesia's a big success story in the last 5 years in the nickel ecosystem globally, because the world is going through a tremendous transition away from petrol engine towards electric vehicles. Most countries are going to shift to electric vehicles completely over the next 20 years. So Indonesia is very strategically positioned to benefit from that very big transition to electric vehicles.
Right. Do you see that in 2024, commodities still be a good or give a big impact to economy in Indonesia?
I think the outlook for commodities is mixed. When we look at different commodities, for example, right now, oil is benefiting from geopolitical risk factors, so oil prices are higher. We've also seen quite a improvement in the outlook for LNG compared to before the Russia-Ukraine war started, because the European Union has had to shift away from pipeline gas towards LNG. So that's resulted in a big change in the global LNG market. It's improved the outlook. And then, of course, Indonesia is benefiting from the nickel situation. This whole shift towards electric vehicles is benefiting strategic metals. Especially nickel is an important commodity that will benefit from that. So I think, broadly speaking, Indonesia is benefiting. But of course, Indonesia in the medium term will also face challenges from the energy transition due to a shift away from thermal coal in some of the big export markets. But in the medium term outlook, most of the big markets for thermal coal, such as India, China, are still going to need thermal coal.